when people tell me about possible parapsychological claims, life after death, things like that, these are possible, but I'm not going to spend my time digging into details about claims about near-death experiences giving evidence for an afterlife, because I know that those claims are incompatible with how I think the physical world works. Likewise for telekinesis or precognition or things like that. The laws of physics don't allow for that. Now, the laws of physics, as we know them, might be wrong. That's always possible. But again, if I'm comparing two possibilities, some sketchy report of someone kind of had a feeling that something bad was going to happen and then it happened, and I have to throw out all the laws of physics, or someone just sort of, reported something with a little bit of imperfect fidelity, then I'm going to stick with the laws of physics.
Hello, this is Robinson Earhart here with the introduction with the whole gang, Mishka the Vishla and Pins the Podcat, to an absolute banger, though it couldn't have been any other way, in the form of Robinson's podcast number 200. And this episode is with Sean Carroll, Daniel Dennett, and Steven Pinker. Sean is Homewood Professor of Natural Philosophy at Johns Hopkins and Fractal Faculty at the Santa Fe Institute. He's also the host of Sean Carroll's Mindscape, which is the best philosophy and science show out there. And Dan is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Tufts University, where he was also co-director of the Center for Cognitive Studies and the Austin B. Fletcher Professor of Philosophy. He's one of the most recognized philosophers out there today, not least in part because of his magnificent beard. And along with Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Richard Dawkins, he's known as one of the Four Horsemen of Atheism. And finally, Steve is Johnstone Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard University, where he writes on and researches the language, mind, and human nature. So this is Sean's third appearance on the show. He joined me and David Albert of Columbia on episode 106 to talk about the many worlds theory of quantum mechanics, entropy and Boltzmann brains, and the fine-tuned universe. And then on episode 118, we spoke with Slavoj Žižek, which was an excellent episode as well, about quantum physics, the multiverse, time travel, and a whole lot more. For Dan, this is his second appearance on the show. On episode 194 a few weeks ago, we spoke about consciousness, free will, the evolution of minds, and also a lot more. And then finally, again, Steve is returning for another centennial episode, as he came on 100 episodes ago for episode 100 to talk about rationality, enlightenment, and free speech. In this episode, number 200, we talk about a lot of neat, enduring, but also topical topics, from artificial intelligence, large language models, and whether or not they threaten democracy or even civilization itself, to parapsychology and violations of the laws of physics, panpsychism and consciousness, some of the philosophical lessons of Darwinian thought, which Dan specializes in, among other things, and then the relationship between science and philosophy and what philosophy even is. Dan's latest book is I've Been Thinking. Steve's latest book is Rationality, what it is, why it seems scarce, why it matters. And Sean's next book, notably, is Quanta and Fields, the biggest ideas in the universe. And that one will be coming out in May, or on May 14th, 2014. And there are links to all of these in the description. You should absolutely check them out. And you should absolutely pre-order Sean's book, which I'm sure we'll be talking about soon. So also in our conversation, Sean mentions a paper on quantum field theory and its relationship to our everyday world, which is particularly relevant to our discussions of consciousness and parapsychology. And I will quote this from the abstract to give you an idea of the conclusion. Just let me pull that up. Therefore, we have reason to be confident that the laws of physics underlying the phenomena of everyday life are completely known. And this paper is linked in the description as well. And there are also links to the past episodes these guests have been on, their websites and Twitters, and so forth. But reviews, subscriptions, likes, comments, all of these things are tremendously appreciated. There's a Patreon if you'd like to support the show, get show notes with every episode, and listen ad-free. Thanks for bearing with this lengthy introduction for episode 200. But finally, we are 200 episodes in. I still feel like I have no idea what I'm doing, and the show is absolutely just getting started. There's a lot good coming, some of which I know about, some of which I'm sure I don't. So if you've been listening for a while or are just turning in now for the first time, from the bottom of my heart, really, thank you. And now, without any further ado, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Sean, Dan, and Steve. Before we get to physics or consciousness or evolution, I'd like to begin with something quite topical for me, since I just used ChatGPT for the first time last week to create an image of Sean, actually, as you guys know, in a mortal battle with a recycling bin, though I see he's recovered from the ordeal. But Dan, you wrote us that you think large language models are, and I'll quote you actually, the most dangerous technology ever developed, capable of leading to the collapse not just of democracy, but of civilization. And my experience with ChatGPT is that it's the single most amazing technology I've encountered, but not the most dangerous. So I was wondering just why you put it that way.
Large language models permit us to make counterfeit people. We've never had to deal with counterfeit people like this before. We evolved to use the intentional stance to treat anything that talks to us as another human agent and to deal with it. We're used to the fact that there are cheats and con men and so forth out there, but this is different. This technology can flood the world with manipulative fake people. And we're ill-equipped to deal with it because we are unable to turn off the intentional stance when we encounter such a phenomenon. And who controls your attention controls you. And I think that we are in danger of losing our free will, being turned into puppets by a sorcerer's apprentice army of fake people like the brooms in the Sorcerer's Apprentice, and that human trust will be jeopardized, and civilization depends on human trust.
And I appreciate the concern about counterfeit people, and I agree with your essay in Atlantic suggesting that there should be laws against counterfeit people. But I'm wondering if the end of civilization might be a bit hyperbolic, because when there are new threats, there are new technologies, there are also countermeasures. And there's a reason to believe that we humans, as we evolved language, also evolved a kind of a built-in suspicion of whether what we are hearing is credible or not. Hugo Mercier wrote an entire book called Not Born Yesterday about the skeptical measures he believes are built into human nature as a necessary accompaniment to language having evolved in the first place. And so if we are as soon as we become aware that there are counterfeit people, we'll be suspicious that the people we're dealing with might be counterfeit. We'll look for more credible, vetted sources. Some evidence that that is already starting to happen is that despite predictions about 6 or 7 years ago that the news media would be permanently polluted by deepfakes once that technology became available, a recent article assessing the deep fake scare shows they've had virtually no influence on politics. People just are alert to the possibility of deep fakes. They don't believe them. The reputable news agencies don't report them. The fake news sites already cater to the most fanatical of the fanatical, so it doesn't really matter. They tell them what they wanted to believe in the first place. But the whole news ecosystem has not been polluted by deepfakes, even though they've been widely available for 6 or 7 years because of these countermeasures. So with countermeasures for other kinds of counterfeit people, can't we avert the collapse of civilization?
Yes, we can. And I've been advocating for those countermeasures all along. But one particular avenue that I don't think is very attractive is that we all learn how to unmask counterfeit people. Because I don't know about you, but I don't want, every time I talk to a friend on the phone or on a situation like this, I don't want them pestering me with gotcha questions and tricky paranoid issues to make sure that I'm real. Any more than I want to look at every $20 bill I get to examine it closely to see if it's fake. I want to trust the technology to take care of that. I think technology can take care of it, but only if we act quickly and vigorously and intelligently. And if you look at Congress today, quick, effective, intelligent are not the terms that come to mind.
I think, let me come in right in the middle here, because I think that I agree with both of you guys. The danger is real. Robinson right now could have saved himself some effort by conjuring up fake AI versions of me and Dan and Steve and made a little podcast. The technology is already good enough to do that. In fact, let me right now put in the mind of the listeners and watchers, are you sure that we are the real Dennett, Steve Pinker, Sean Carroll, Robinson Earhart? I mean, how would you know? But I think at the end, complex adaptive systems are adaptive. And I think that, like Steve says, we will adapt a little bit. It might be worse overall, but I don't think it's going to be end of civilization type worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've got a lot of accusations on comments that I conjured up you and Slavoj actually in our conversation, and that wasn't the actual versions of you. But I think
what are you talking about? What interview are you talking about?
When you and I spoke with Slavoj Žižek.
I have no recollection of that. I don't know what you're talking about, Robinson.
You got me.
That is not in my database.
I think the key word in that quote, since I still have it, of Dan's, is that it's capable of leading to the collapse, not just of democracy, but civilization. So you're not saying that it will, just that it's capable of doing
saying
that.
It's something we have to guard against.
Yeah. Sean, though, if I'm correct, I'm wondering whether you're more concerned about AGI for our long-term future than LLMs.
For me, no. I don't have any special worry about AGI. I think that, in fact, it's more or less the opposite. I think that, AGI may or may not happen. It's not on the horizon in the very short term, but the rate of progress is very quick, so I'm not going to predict when it happens. We don't have it now. Well, I'm concerned about the fact that intelligence of the human sort is apparently so easy to fake, even when you don't have it. And so, and I think that is, even if it's not, let me put on the pessimist hat now, even if civilization in some sense adapts and is fine, democracy is already very much fragile. And a tiny little bit of perturbation can easily push it the wrong way. So even though I think that, humankind is not going to be beaten back by AGI into the Stone Age, we might very well have some tremendous upheaval in our political or social system just because the tendency was already there, and here's a new tool to hasten it along.
Yeah, I fully agree, Sean. I think you've put the issue very well. And Norbert Wiener was there many, many years ago in The Human Use of Human Beings. He said, you got to remember that a tool is also a weapon, and that if you make a powerful tool, it will soon be in the hands of your enemies as well. And defense is usually more expensive than offense.
Steve, am I right, though, just to put a bow tie on this, that for you, the development of LLMs might fit into your general framework of enlightenment and the idea that humanity is making progress through rationality, and this is just one of many technologies that sort of changes our way of life, but maybe like the development of nuclear weapons, that could pose an existential threat, but in the end, it doesn't, through the sorts of countermeasures.
Yeah, a couple of things. Large language models aren't the same as artificial intelligence, and I have some skepticism as to whether large language models, which capitalize fortuitously on the availability of human-generated content on the web, and that itself might be limited by the new copyright lawsuits filed by the New York Times, together with the development of graphic processing units that just make it more feasible to crunch unthinkably gargantuan data sets compared to in the past. And so I think the fact that for a couple of developments have made large language models the quickest route to some simulacrum of intelligence shouldn't confuse us into thinking that artificial intelligence and large language models are the same thing, because large language models don't have propositional understanding of the world. There are no facts. There's no concepts of objects or people or things or places, which is why they're so vulnerable to hallucinations. So putting aside the particular technology of large language models, which is one way of doing artificial intelligence, I think there is enormous progress for artificial intelligence to enhance human well-being, simply because we know that in so many realms, the human mind is just not capable of dealing with complexity that challenges us, such as, say, medical decision making. I see my doctor. Why should I think that my entire genome, my entire medical history, the entire medical literature, with all of its contradictions, should be graspable by the guy that just happens to be sitting across from me in that room? It's beyond the capability of any human mind, and an ability to absorb all of the relevant data from genome, medical history, epigenome, and so on, together with all the contradictory data out there, is something where I think there's tremendous progress. I'm speaking here also as a cognitive psychologist, aware of the limitations of the human mind in dealing with large amounts of data. Going back to the 50s, a simple regression formula outperformed any human expert in any area in which data were available. Artificial intelligence could supercharge the ability to extract useful knowledge out of data, together with a lot of the human suffering that is a consequence of the fact that we still use human labor and the lower levels of human cognitive processing to do a lot of drudgery that could be automated to the benefit of humanity. Now, I think there are also threats, as there are with any technology. I think the fears of AI takeover, of it turning us into raw materials, as collateral damage, of megalomaniacal AI seeking to subjugate us, are all overblown. But these might be topics for another conversation.
Yeah. Certainly, there's a lot of overblown fear-mongering out there. I think that one way of looking at this is that the use of LLMs that might be really benign and useful is to use it as a generator in a generate and test system where the tester is the editor, is the judgment, is the cherry picker, and we let the LLM just generate a whole lot of stuff. Some of it will be hallucinogenic, some of it won't. It might be a very good way of getting off-the-wall ideas that you wouldn't otherwise think of into the conversation. It's a little bit dangerous, but we have many examples of human collaborations where you got a sort of wacky generator, a person who has lots of ideas, most of which should be thrown out, and a wise editor who does a careful cherry-picking selection on those ideas. I think that's one of the areas where I think even LLMs could prove useful, just as a source, a non-chaotic, well, as a source, as a generator of diversity, where the diversity will tend to have something to do with whatever you're interested in.
I guess, although the large language models seem to have been engineered for banality more than for creativity so far.
But I think that's probably tweakable.
Yeah.
Well,
actually,
it may be, again, I think we shouldn't equate large language models with artificial intelligence. And it could be that there's a form of artificial intelligence that does that may just be more than soaking up massive statistical patterns out of gargantuan data sets.
Actually, speaking of off-the-wall ideas and creativity, last week in my experimentation with ChatGPT, I queried it if it could give me 10 ideas for curing vampirism with surgical methods. And it gave me 10 great ideas. One of them was intracranial rune implantation, where you take off the top half of the skull of the vampire and you put in runes meant to ward off the vampirism. But there were 10 really great ideas that I never would have come up with. And then returning to Dan's original comment or worry about counterfeit people, the main place that I've had a problem with this is with dating apps, which are now flooded with AI-generated images and profiles. But I know that we didn't want to spend too much time on this. One thing that I've been thinking about, though, since making this image of Sean battling the recycling bin, is that all of the times that I have needed to use graphic designers in the past, even now for making podcast thumbnails, all of this stuff is quite easily done through ChatGPT or some of these other art generators like Midjourney. And also I washed a fancy pair of jeans on New Year's Day, and I asked ChatGPT for 10 different ways of washing denim and the sorts of effects they would have. And it gave them to me instantly, which saved me a ton of research on clothing sites. Sean recently had a great interview with a fashion blogger and writer named Derek Guy. But I see this totally putting tons of people out of work over the next 5, 10, 20 years. And I'm wondering, this seems like a very existential threat to the way society goes now. And I'm wondering what sorts of safeguards or countermeasures you see for this, in particular, Steve, since you brought up the countermeasures.
Oh, there have been predictions of massive technological unemployment since the 60s, probably before, and it's never happened because new jobs materialize as quickly as old ones become obsolete. So we haven't missed the fact that there are no longer elevator operators or telephone switchboard operators, because new jobs like website designers have arisen. And as Joel Mocher put it, maybe all the unemployed truck drivers will become tattoo removal technicians or pet psychiatrists or video game costume designers. We just can't predict what jobs might materialize. Now, I don't want to, this doesn't mean that they will. So far, there have been very few signs of technologically driven unemployment. And it may be that, the soft landing would be that another fear, namely underpopulation, the fact that industrialized countries and probably the rest of the world to follow will soon be at below replacement rate of fertility, with fears that there won't be enough people to do the work that has to be done, might partly be compensated for by the fact that a lot of jobs that used to be done by humans will be automated to everyone's benefit.
Sean, Dan, do you have any thoughts on this?
I'll just say very quickly, I did another podcast a couple of years ago before ChatGPT, et cetera, with John Danaher, who's a philosopher, who says, look, let's at least contemplate the possibility of a coming automated utopia. That, yeah, indeed, technology, AI, and robots get rid of a lot of the jobs, and they're the jobs that we don't want to do. And we get so much productivity from this that we can give everyone a universal income and just have a good time. Maybe the society does not really have the impetus or gumption to make that happen, but it's within our ability to contemplate making that happen. Maybe it's something to keep in mind as a goal.
Yeah.
I think the problem that I'm pointing at, though, is we're living in a world now where ChatGPT is not cleaning our sewers or toiling in the fields, but now it's doing our art and it's doing our writing. It's not doing the jobs that we hoped robots would do. It's doing the jobs that we think humans should be doing and enjoying. It's making music. It's doing all sorts of the really fun things. It'll probably be doing philosophy and cognitive science and
maybe.
And
some of it, especially when it comes to art, might run up against just the problem of people's hunger for authenticity, for the fact that people really do pay more for an original Picasso than a lifelike fake indiscriminate. It can't be discriminated from the original. People will pay more for Bruce Springsteen's guitar than for another guitar that just happens not to be Bruce Springsteen's, but otherwise is indistinguishable. People go to concerts, they go to museums. It seems to matter to people what the provenance is of works of art. We don't know how much that will run up against the just the economic advantages of mass producing art with these generative models, and also the fact that they're amazingly, they're surprisingly good. Not that many of them are so good that they, as yet, will replace human-generated content in terms of what people really enjoy or willing to pay for. That day may come. It certainly isn't here yet, and it's not clear that the generative model technology, which involves just sucking up statistical patterns from massive data sets, will be the route to generating the kind of art or the kind of philosophy or the kind of essays that people find valuable.
Sean, Steve mentioned to me, and I echo this question, especially as I'm often asked to interview people like Rupert Sheldrake on parapsychology, for instance, that he was curious to hear your thoughts on the relationship between our knowledge of physics and what we don't know about it on the one hand, and then on the other, our tendency to rule out parapsychology or other anomalous physical phenomena. So maybe the tic-tac UFOs are a good example, though. Steve, if you want to add onto this, please do.
Yeah, I mean, it's a important thing, and it's really why I wrote my whole book, The Big Picture, because we live in a world academically where we silo each other into humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, and then subdivide then. But it's all one world that we live in. So these arguments about parapsychology or religion, for that matter, are not independent of what we know about the natural sciences, physics and biology, etc. Arguments about free will. Dan recently had a debate with Robert Sapolsky, and I I didn't see the debate, but I presume there was some talk about neuroscience. I think that physics is relevant there too. I don't ever think you can rule things out or prove that things are impossible in a metaphysical or mathematically logical sense. But as good Bayesians, we can drive our credences for certain things to very, very small numbers. So when people tell me about possible parapsychological claims, life after death, things like that, these are possible, but I'm not going to spend my time digging into details about claims about near-death experiences giving evidence for an afterlife, because I know that those claims are incompatible with how I think the physical world works. Likewise for telekinesis or precognition or things like that. The laws of physics don't allow for that. Now, the laws of physics, as we know them, might be wrong. That's always possible. But again, if I'm comparing two possibilities, some sketchy report of someone kind of had a feeling that something bad was going to happen and then it happened, and I have to throw out all the laws of physics, or someone just sort of, reported something with a little bit of imperfect fidelity, then I'm going to stick with the laws of physics.
Sean, can you say more? Because I've had to invoke your book a number of times, including in a debate that I had with a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, Brian Michelson, that why it is that, say, clairvoyance or extrasensory perception are ruled out by the laws of physics. That is, I say that, but of course I'm not a physicist and you are. And you were more specific in the big picture as to why forms of energy that would be as yet undiscovered that could be the basis for, say, precognition or clairvoyance. We have actually positive reason to believe that they don't exist, not just that our current physics hasn't yet discovered them.
No, that's exactly right. And that's a very good point. In fact, I'll pass on to Robinson, and he can include in the show notes a more complete paper that I wrote making exactly that point a few years ago. The point is that our best deep understanding of the universe right now is in terms of quantum field theory. And it's not just because it's what is the best fit. It's because if you want certain cherished beliefs to be true, like relativity, quantum mechanics, locality, quantum field theory has to be the way you describe the world at the fundamental level. And that means everything is fields, and we know what the fields are that we interact with. So again, it's not just that we found some, but who knows, there could be other fields out there. We know that if there are other fields that we haven't yet found, they're going to have certain properties. They can't interact with us too strongly. Otherwise, we would have found them already. We have searched for all of the ways in which the fields that you and I are made of, the electrons, the protons, the photons, all the different ways they can interact with other fields. They're not there. So either they're too short range to be noticeable in our experiments, or they're too massive to be constructed or produced unless you have a Large Hadron Collider in your pocket. And of the fields that we know, only two of them stretch over macroscopic distances: electromagnetic fields and gravitational fields. And gravitational fields are very weak and very dumb. They can only attract other things. They're very easy to notice. So basically, the short version of this is that any physical effect that stretches over much further than the size of a big molecule has to be electromagnetic in nature, except for very straightforward things like the Earth pulling us down gravitationally. And so if you want to have some macroscopic force to bend a spoon, stretching from your brain to a spoon, it has to be the electromagnetic force. There are no other forces allowed in nature to do that. So you could just test it. I mean, number one, the brain does not have the capacity to make an electromagnetic force that will bend a spoon. But also, you could just put a little electromagnetic field detector in between your brain and the spoon to see it happening. It's not going to happen because the brain doesn't have that capacity. But the point is that the laws of physics don't have room for new fields, new forces that would let you change the configuration of matter a short distance away, perceive into the future, etc. Because if there were, such fields, we would have detected them already. That's very cut and dried, according to modern physics.
So I quote this little number quite often, but this is just to recapitulate and maybe summarize a little bit. Because QFT has been confirmed to something like 14 decimal places, if you were to be looking for precognition or clairvoyance or something like this, you would not be searching for a new form of energy or a new force. You would be looking in a framework that already includes quantum field theory.
Well, I have to be honest. So I do want to make, I don't care whether there is precognition or clairvoyance or telekinesis or life after death. I just want to follow what the evidence says. If you violate the rules of quantum field theory, then all bets are off. Then any one of these things is possible. The information in our brains is contained in configurations of our neurons and how they tie together and how they fire. And when you die, all that information goes away. There's no place for your memories and your legacy to sort of exist in some cloud of knowledge and some soul stuff. Unless you just say, no, modern physics is wrong, quantum field theory is not right, it's something completely non-physical, non-natural. But then it is your burden to tell me exactly how that works. How does this non-physical soul stuff interact with the stuff that is definitely in my brain, all the electrons and photons and neurons that are definitely clearly doing things? I have a picture in the big picture of an MEG that I was in, a magnetic encephalograph. So when I have thoughts, little magnetic fields appear very close to my brain. We can detect those fields. How does that change? How does that information convey itself into this spooky soul stuff? Once you write down some equations for that happening, I'll be much more willing to listen.
I think
because of course were it real, precognition or clairvoyance would be some of the most interesting new phenomena to be inducted into our scientific picture of the world. Should I take it that the reason that you aren't interviewing people about this on Mindscape is that you have not found thinkers that have compelling evidence or accounts compatible with your scientific worldview to talk about this?
Right. I mean, to be super clear, it's not even a close call. It's not like there are some models out there of how the configurational information about electrons and neurons in my brain could be embedded and transferred to some non-physical soul stuff. There's just nothing. There's no good ideas. People don't even try. So I'm just not, for my own podcast, Mindscape, I have people on where I disagree with them, happy to do that. But I want to have people where there's something to learn from talking to them, even if that thing to learn is just how to think skeptically and carefully about possibilities that I don't personally agree with. But stuff like this non-physical bending of spoons or life after death stuff, that has very, 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 very tiny credence in my mind. It's not worth spending time on.
Yeah. Can I add something? Because I referred to Brian Michelson. I meant Brian Josephson. Who is
yes.
a bona fide physicist. He's got a Nobel Prize, and he takes this stuff seriously, including things like dogs know when their owners are about to come home, and people know when you're staring at them behind their back. Now, again, I'm with you. I cite you in terms of why this is physically implausible. Maybe even impossible. But as a psychologist and influenced by Dan's own exposition of the intentional stance as something that we humans are apt to take, it also strikes me that the desire to believe that the universe makes these things possible comes from a mismatch between the way we naturally conceive the world, we human beings, and something that physicists have discovered long ago but don't often articulate, namely that the universe is not intentional, is not teleological. There are laws that predict the future based on the present, but that don't work backwards and take intended goals into account and channel physical events to bring them into existence. So very human convictions like there are no coincidences, everything happens for a reason. The outcome of an event was one of the reasons that the event happened, which of course is true for events that we humans bring into being by our own actions. But there is a tendency to project that kind of intentionality onto the universe that makes a number of these claims intuitively plausible, but probably physically impossible. My problem is I haven't been able to get clear statements from something that I think just physicists take as second nature and don't bother to articulate, namely the laws of the universe just don't care about our goals, our concepts, our values. They just happen. That seems to be the biggest breach between our intuitions and the picture of the universe given to us by our best physics.
But there's a point. I've been following the development of this point now for some time, and I think David Haig has put it wonderfully in his parable of the bathtub. Right. There's no teleology out there in physics, but what there is the ratchet of evolution. And the ratchet of evolution has the effect of creating reliabilities, setting up causal mechanisms that absorb chaos and that use chaos in interesting ways. His example of the bathtub is wonderful. He says, look, let water fill a bathtub, and it can come from all sorts of different sources, rain and pouring in a bottle of water and the tap and so forth. However the water got there, when you pull the plug, it's all going out the same hole. The fate of the water doesn't depend on its prehistory. It depends on its current history in the designed structure that it's in. And the same thing is true of us. Look at us. 4 people. Here we are. Each of us is, to oversimplify, there are 4 entities that have over 1 trillion moving parts each. Their names are Steve, Sean, Robinson, and Dan. And we were darn sure that we were going to show up here today, in spite of the fact that all sorts of interferences and noise and chaos was going to go on. But we would have bet good money and we would have won. We're going to show up to do this here now. Why? Because we're responsible, because we're determined, because we have agreed we're going to do this. Now, those are facts that you can't explain at the level of atomic physics or subatomic physics. Those are facts that can only be explained at an evolutionary level and a post-evolutionary level, where that is we have to look at how each of us is an amazingly designed thing made of designed things, made of designed things, made of designed things, made of designed things, right down to the motor proteins, right down to the ribosomes, but also right down to the circuits in our brain that decide what promises we're going to make and the way that we can recover from unforeseen disasters that happen on the way to this meeting. All of these things are explicable only at a high level. Yeah. David Haig has as the epigraph for his little parable of the bathtub, probably the most important sentence I ever wrote, and I made the stupid mistake of putting it in parentheses, and that is, if you make yourself really small, you can externalize virtually everything. What seems just inbuilt to human thinking is, the first person point of view, which gradually recedes into the Cartesian theater where there's an agent, an ego that is not material. If you're Descartes, it's not material. It's a res cogitans. It's very small. And it's almost impossible for us to avoid adopting that first-person point of view, where there's me, and then there's my body with all of its complexity. And what we have to realize is, no, that body with all its complexity, and not just the brain, as Antonio Damasio has insisted, the body itself plays a big role in the modulation, revision, decision of all those parts. We're large, and it's because we're very, very, very large things with trillions of moving parts that we have this breathtakingly useful predictability. But we also have to recognize that our predictability can't be perfect. We don't want it to be perfect. We want to reserve a layer of unpredictability so that we will not be taken over and controlled by other agents. And it's this balance between predictability and unpredictability that is the control problem that is known to philosophers and to everybody, actually, is the problem of free will. We all have free will. You're all responsible for being here. You're responsible for keeping your promises. I trust you. You're safe. But I can't read your minds perfectly, and it's a jolly good thing that I can't.
Yeah, it's an intriguing idea that I borrowed in Rationality, that because there are game theoretic situations we often are faced with, outguessing standoffs, kind of captured in the game of scissors, paper, rock,
yes,
where the best strategy, it's not a winning strategy because there isn't one, but the best strategy is to be completely and utterly random, because any deviation from randomness will be capitalized on by your opponent. And there are many outguessing standoffs in life. In sports, like a penalty kicker and a goalie. In a volunteer situation, who is going to actually get up and empty the trash or report the crime? Everyone wants to be done, but everyone hopes someone else will do it. And the best strategy is to volunteer to do it with some probability, but not one that's too predictable. Otherwise, other people will exploit you into always being the one. But anyway, it is an intriguing idea that some of the phenomena we call free will are an adaptation to not be outguessed in outguessing competitions by being, by design, ineliminably random.
We want to be practically unpredictable, but that doesn't mean that we want randomness in the quantum sense.
No, and of course there has to be
physical, chaotic. The unpredictability of a coin flip is all we need. All you have to do is keep your coin flip secret.
Yeah. And of course, we want there has to be enough predictability that we can have incentives, that we can have laws that allow enough predictability that if you make robbing a liquor store illegal, fewer people will rob liquor stores. And if you pay people a good salary, more people will put in the work or choose that line of work. So we're not completely random either, but there must be some mixture of responsiveness to incentives with enough of a random element that you can't be gamed.
Yep, exactly. I'm amused by the title of Robert Sapolsky's book, Determined. And I think nowhere in the book does he draw attention to the fact that in everyday speech, determined is sometimes used as a word of praise. She's so determined.
Okay.
You can count on her. You can count on her to do the job. She'll overcome every obstacle. That's actually one of the key features of free will. is to be reliable so that other agents will treat you as a politically free agent that they can trust, the way I trust you.
I would. It would be nice to win the Nobel Prize in Physics someday, because that any old nonsense that I would spout would have to be taken seriously just for that reason. But and many people have taken advantage of the nice feature of it. But let me quote a different Nobel Prize winner, Steven Weinberg, who said, "The more we understand the universe, the more it seems pointless." And I think that this goes to Steve's point that there is something to be explained here. And it's to me absolutely fascinating and important that the laws of physics don't care about the future. They don't know where we're going. In fact, I bang on in every single book I write about the Laplacian paradigm for physics, which says if you know the state of the universe right now, you can predict where it's going to go, at least statistically, and where it came from. There's details and footnotes there. But the point is, all of the information about the state of the universe is contained in the present moment. Physics does not work by saying, here we are, and here is where we want to go. It just works by saying, here we are. But nevertheless, as Dan has written about and other people, we talk at the macroscopic human level as if we have goals, as if we have purposes, intentions, desires. And that's nowhere to be found in the laws of physics. The only difference between the past and future that is relevant to physics is that the early universe had low entropy. It was orderly. It was in a very, very specific kind of state. And ever since then, there's no special future state. There's a special fact about the past. So there's an interesting research level question. One of the things I'm very interested in myself right now, which is how in the course of cosmic evolution, despite the fact that the only specification that we need to say what the world does is in the past, not in the future, how did subsets of the universe start thinking in terms of future goals? How did teleology evolve? How did it come into existence in a purely physical way? The answer has to be that there are, things about sustainability and stability and reproduction and fitness and things like that arise from the fact that the entropy was low in the past. But it turns out that the best way to survive is to predict the future. It's not mystical. It's not magical. It's not in against violating the laws of physics. But there is some details. There are details to be worked out there that I'm very excited to think about.
Yeah.
I think that's good.
Have you spoken about this at all with your colleague, Janan Ismail? She was just on the show, and we talked a little bit about this, and then her work building off of David Albert and Barry Lower's Mentaculus and the past hypothesis. And all. Have you talked to her at all about this?
Yes, very much. I mean, Jane and I are very simpatico in these questions. So she's a great person to talk to. I just think that all of them, Janan and David Albert and Barry Lower and all these people, they need more equations in what they're doing. I think what they're doing is exactly right, but it's a little philosophical. Bless their hearts. And so I would like to quantify it a little bit more. We have a revolution is going on right now in non-equilibrium statistical mechanics. And Barry Lower had this great quote that I'm going to repeat ad nauseum in the future, which is, he says, "I was so surprised when I finally realized that all of the interesting problems in philosophy could be solved by looking at statistical mechanics." And I think that's right, at least slight exaggeration, but it's in the right track. And I think that thinking harder about statistical mechanics in a modern sense is going to just open a whole bunch of doors onto understanding emergence and complexity and goals and teleology and intentionality and agency and all of these things that we have some good ideas about right now, but they're not yet quite firmed up.
I think, tell me if you agree with this, Sean. Donald Mackay, one of my heroes, the late Donald N. Mackay, a Scottish cybernetician and physicist, said Laplace's demon can have, if you like total information about the future of the world for the usual Laplacian demon reasons. But you can't interact with that world, and you can't exploit that information. And that is, I think, part of the I think that's a key point that helps explain why we have the world of agents and persons, because our knowledge is strictly limited because we are part of the universe. We're not
I think
outside the universe.
I think that's a good point. I think when you tell people about determinism in the sense of physics or philosophy, people who are not professional physicists or philosophers will often get it confused, either explicitly or implicitly, with fate, right?
Yep.
With predestination.
Yep.
I'm going to grow up to be the princess, right? You know, even though I'm struggling to sweep the fireplace out right now, there is a prophecy that and that's not what physics determinism is like, because all of the relevant information to make those predictions about the future is completely hidden from us. So the analogy I use is it's not like you meet three wizened crones over a bubbling cauldron and they tell you what's going to happen to you in the future. It's like you meet an annoying little kid who says, I know what's going to happen to you in the future. And you say, okay, what's going to happen? And the kid says, I'm not going to tell you. And then something happens and the kid says, I knew that was going to happen. How would this affect your life, even if the kid really did know it, right? If the kid cannot tell you, if there's no way to extract from the universe this knowledge, we have to, in practice, think differently, for example, by acting as if there's free will.
Mm-hmm. Sapolsky does quote at length in Determined. I talked to him about it a little while ago, and then I talked to Dan right afterward. But he quotes a lot of the literature in psychology that knowing that or believing in determinism and having an undermined sense of free will does not actually impact anyone's behavior. People do not run amok if they're given that sort of sense. But Steve,
I think this might actually be where Dan and I disagree, because about that fact, whether it's true or not, I could not possibly care less. I think that free will is important to talk about because it's the best way to model human beings. I don't know any actual human being who does not get annoyed with other human beings when they act in certain ways. There are no human beings who just say, well, I guess that's what the wave function of the universe would have predicted was going to happen all along. We think in terms of free will, whether it makes us better people or otherwise. I'm sorry, Steve, that you had to run away when I was giving the answer to your question, but I talked a lot about entropy and the fact that, to me, it's a super interesting research level question. How did localized subsystems of the universe start to care about the future, start to act in terms of goals and predictions and things like that, even though the laws of physics themselves just care about what the current state is? I think, there's an answerable question, but I think that we're still very much along the way to providing those answers.
I mean, I'm glad this came because I was going to bring it up a couple of minutes before. Dan alluded earlier to Norbert Wiener and the human use of human beings, and more generally his invention of a field that we no longer call cybernetics. But I think he did address that paradox in the and tried to answer it in the language of control systems, that is, of feedback. And probably our pre-theoretical idea of a system that is goal-directed in a universe where the laws just work forward, not backward. They can't, nothing gets determined in terms of how good or bad the outcome would be. It just happens. But we do. And I think a key is that you can specify purely physical systems that have a goal state, that is a representation of that can be sensed. They have some input measurement of the current state. They have an inventory of actions with predictable consequences of the world, and the system can be set up so that when there's a discrepancy between the goal state and the current state, an action is effected that on average reduces that difference. There could be, if there are many of them, we consider it to be an intelligent system, like a brain. There are aspects of natural selection that work that way. That is, that the consequences of a physical event can feed back on the likelihood of copies being made, which gives us the illusion of teleology or of goal-directedness, even though it's just a feed-forward process. And that there be, I think, a place for a field of study that George Williams called teleonomy, that is, systems that look as if they're teleological, that they're goal-directed, that the future can affect the past, while, of course, conforming to the feed-forward laws of physics. And natural selection, cybernetic systems like cruise control on your car or a thermostat, the human brain with many qualitative combinatorial means of bringing about events that would reduce the difference between a goal state and a current state would all be examples of these teleonomic systems.
It's amazing that George Williams found the need to talk about teleonomy because teleology had such a bad press in the sciences. And maybe that's the way to go. Maybe we should simply drop the word teleology and go for teleonomy. But there's nothing illusory about it. It's just control theory. And I like to use the example of a rock dislodged in an earthquake rolling down a mountain. And let's say it's determined. Where it goes is determined. It's determined by all the forces that act on it, gravity, where it bounces, etc. Now have a skier racing down the same mountain. She is under control. They're both determined systems. But the skier is much more likely to arrive at the same place within a small degree of error, no matter how many times she does the run, whereas the rock is not. And that's the difference between being in control, which the skier is, and not. The rock isn't controlled by the past because the past has no feedback. The rock's trajectory is caused by the sum of all the events that lead up to its trajectory. But there's no feedback mechanism. As soon as you add the feedback, as soon as you add the control, you change the nature of the phenomenon in precisely the way that matters. And if we can call that teleonomy, we can call it teleology, but it's everywhere in biology. It's not in physics.
It's not, although we tend to project it outward onto the laws of the universe, which is why creationism and astrology and synchronicity and the vague sense that everything happens for a purpose is so compelling.
Yeah, and philosophers, I'm afraid, have not done a good job of dissuading us from doing that. But
people ask questions like, why me? Why do bad things happen to good people? The answer is, why not? why would you ever think?
Well, there is a problem here philosophically. Dan alludes to this. There's this thing called the principle of sufficient reason, right? This idea that comes down most famously from Leibniz, that everything happens for a reason. And sometimes this is interpreted very innocently as not anything goes, right? There are laws. There's, a causal chain of interaction in physics or whatever. But as I like to point out, if you pick up a book on classical mechanics or quantum mechanics or general relativity, the words cause and effect never appear. in these books, because the laws of physics don't work that way. They're patterns. They're differential equations that say one damn thing after another, a specific thing after another, but they work equally well forwards and backwards. They don't attribute causes to things. So when I debated William Lane Craig, and he wants to say anything that begins needs a cause. The universe begins, therefore the universe needs a cause. Therefore God exists. And he expects the cosmologist to argue about whether or not the universe had a beginning. But I argued about whether or not everything that begins needs to have a cause, because I think that the idea of cause is purely emergent, macroscopic, human scale, not something that should be found in the fundamental workings of the universe.
Yeah, Bertrand Russell said that the concept of causality survives because, like the monarchy, it is mistakenly believed to do no harm.
Lovely
and that's
quote.
It's a subtle idea that I think we should try harder to get across.
Let me make another point. You say look through the books of the physicists and the books and articles, and you won't find the word cause. And I have recently been inviting students and others that I've been talking with about this. See if you can find an article, peer-reviewed article, in the most hard-bitten, scientifically tough biology journal you can think of. You choose it. See if you can find an article that doesn't at any point talk about function and, in effect, teleonomy.
Or cause.
Or cause.
I mean, what causes AIDS? What causes COVID?
But I'm more concerned that so many biologists seem to have a certain false consciousness about this. They think they're ardent anti-teleologists, and they're engineers. They're talking about mechanisms everywhere. You cannot talk about the ribosome, for instance, without talking about all the functions that the parts do, why they do the things they do, and so forth. And that's just...
Well, there's a sense in which human psychology, and this is something that I've written about in the Stuff of Thought, where there are huge mismatches between our intuitive physics and real physics. Our concept of time as having a past, present, and future. Our concept of matter as stuff that is stuff all the way down at any scale. That of objects as discrete entities. Of causation as a kind of oomph or impetus that gets transferred to things. These are all our concept of discrete places and paths, all of which are reflected in language fairly directly. Our nouns, our verbs, our tenses, our prepositions don't have counterparts in real physics, but do have counterparts in engineering. That is, at the macroscopic level of physics combined with human goals, you can't avoid things like cause and container and substance and present versus future. And I suggest that human cognition evolved not to deal with regularities at the levels that physicists document them, but regularities at the levels that engineers, including we human intuitive engineers, have to deal with the world, which you can't avoid notions like function, cause, purpose, agency, objects.
This is where Judea Pearl's work comes in very valuably. And there's that lovely quote from Thomas Pynchon's novel, Gravity's Rainbow, where somebody says, nothing does anything, things just happen. No, that's physics.
It's not cognitive psychology.
In the engineering world and the biological world, things do things.
Yeah. I'm going to have to say goodbye now. It's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Robinson, thanks for having me on.
Great to see you, Steve.
Nice to talk to you, Dan. Nice to talk to you, Sean. Bye.
Thanks, Steve.
Well, I think this calls for a slight maybe change of subject for a moment. I wanted to go back to a couple of things. I wanted to flag Dan's example of the four of us, now three of us, showing up here, despite the fact that we're composed of each a trillion very complex little objects. And it just reminds me of something I read a long time ago. I don't know if it was in one of your papers, Dan, or one of your books, but an example that really jumped out at me. And it was something along these lines. If a Martian that takes the physical stance sees me opening a chocolate bar, they have to do this Martian would have to do such an enormous calculation. It would need so much data just to be able to determine that I'm going to eat this chocolate bar. Whereas a human taking the intentional stance does it in the blink of an eye with, to use one of your terms, maybe vanishingly low data in comparison to the Martian.
Yeah.
And I just loved this.
Yeah, I think my original example was the Martian is in somebody's house, the phone rings, the woman of the house answers the phone, and here's, "Hi, I'm bringing Joe home for supper." And she says, "Okay, stop off and buy a bottle of wine on the way." And sure enough, half an hour later, her husband shows up, and he's got a bottle of wine and a guest. Now, the Martian Laplacian has predicted all this, but only by tracing out all the atoms. He said in the intervening space, no, you don't have to do that. You can cut to the chase. You know what's going to happen because the intentional stance is that breathtakingly usable and largely accurate and reliable way of anticipating what's going to happen next. And that's what life is all about, is anticipating what happens next and dealing with it.
You know, I would emphasize that this, to me, I agree with absolutely everything that both you have just said. To me, it's an example of emergence. It's not special to human beings or even the intentional stance. It's an example of a real pattern, to use another one of Dan's phrases. If you ask the Martian, who is standing in for Laplace's demon, here's the Earth, so here's what time it is now. What time will the sun be seen to rise tomorrow? And they say, well, okay, I've got to write down the position and the velocity of all of the atoms in the Earth and evolve it forward in time using the laws of physics. And this is going to take me a while, but I'll do it. Whereas we can do something much simpler because we treat the Earth as a solid sphere and it's rotating at a certain rate, right?
Yeah.
And this is a real pattern that is a feature of the physical world, that we can find predictabilities with, again, vanishingly small fractions of the total available information that might be out there. And human beings absolutely take advantage of that. They're much more efficient than Laplace's demon.
Yeah, that's good. I just want to add, because I'm so used to being confronted on this score. You've used the word emergence. Yes, but in the sense of innocent emergence. For many people, emergence is a sort of code word for almost mystical. You know,
it is, and
you want to turn that off. There's nothing woo-woo about this sense of emergence at all.
No, in fact, very much the opposite. And this is a battle that I've been fighting. I would love to just find a different word, honestly, than emergence, because I completely agree with you in certain corners of the discourse. Basically, you don't have emergence unless it's magical and impossible to understand. And I want to make it be exactly the opposite of that.
Exactly. One of my favorite examples of emergence is all the amazing forms in John Conway's Life World. I said, look, these are emergent phenomena, but they are absolutely deducible, predictable from the rules of the game. It's just that they're surprising, and it's just amazing that there are these higher level regularities, but it's no mystery about it. I mean, they're real patterns.
Yeah, good. Just checking.
But while we're on the topic, illusions are real too. They're real illusions.
Okay. Sure.
My current name for my theory of consciousness is illusionism.
I don't think
a
that's
lot
a
of
good
people. A lot of people hate that. Maybe you do.
I do.
Well, but I'll tell you. Let me defend it. Let me defend it. Think of your telephone, your smartphone. Think of the user illusion on its face. That's real. You're not the victim of it, you're the beneficiary. You don't want to know all the billions of details behind the scenes that make those apps do what they do. That's what illusionism is. Consciousness, what you and I and Robinson have, all the rest of the people paying attention to this, is we have an extremely limited, somewhat metaphorical, and extremely useful, manipulable, valuable, helpful amount of knowledge about what's going on inside us. We don't know what's going on in our brains except via this illusion. Now, when one of my favorite quotes from John Searle, because I don't like to shoot straw men. I like to get real people who say things that are wrong, that now I have a proper target. And he says at one point, remember, always insist on the first person point of view. And I think that's the single worst bit of advice anybody working on consciousness has ever offered. Because if you insist on the first person point of view, you never get to ask the hard questions about how the heck it works. Because from the first person point of view, we're clueless. You don't know how your thoughts come to you. Right now, you don't know what processes are churning in the background that are vying for which words you're going to speak next. Thank goodness you don't. You're the user of your own brain, and you are able to use your brain as well as you do because of this wonderful user illusion, which is consciousness. Well, we have to make sure that people realize this doesn't mean that there's a little homunculus in there looking at all the show, because the homunculus is part of the user illusion too. You don't need the screen. You don't need the theater. You just need the oversimplification and occasional distortion of the information that you have about what you're doing in your own thinking. That's why I call it illusionism.
Are we to take it that you think that consciousness is an illusion, or just that something like qualia are illusions?
Well, qualia are the properties that philosophers insist consciousness has. And I say, no, there's no place for those properties, because the properties that do the work have to be functional properties. They have to be the properties that get you to act, to prefer, to lament, to jump, to cry, and qualia, by philosophical tradition aren't those kind of properties. They're intrinsic properties. You don't need any intrinsic properties. Those aren't real at all. Qualia just aren't real. But consciousness is perfectly real. It's just not composed of qualia.
But is it an illusion, consciousness?
Yeah, so just to clarify on my end is Dan, what's illusory is just the idea that the first person view of what's going on in the brain is all or really what's happening inside our skulls. But that is just a simplified model of what's happening in our skulls.
Right.
And my guess about what you think, Sean, is that you don't like the connotation of the name illusionism, that consciousness
I want
itself is
Dan
an
to
illusion.
tell me whether he thinks consciousness is an illusion.
All right. I will address that question completely directly. Consciousness is the name of a whole variety of phenomena that extend down to amoebas and trees and sponges and dogs and cats and robots. And the idea that there's one phenomenon, which is, the light is on or off. Either you're conscious, you're a zombie, or you aren't. That's one of the worst ideas that is currently fashionable. That idea of consciousness as a supercalifragilisticexpialidocious property that divides the universe in two, that's an illusion. Consciousness is real. It just isn't what you think it is.
So I'm going to maintain my position that believing consciousness is real and calling your stance illusionism about consciousness is asking for trouble. There's got to be a better name.
well, let's talk about that, because I've noticed I say the same thing about free will.
Sure.
It's real, but it isn't what you think it is.
And I agree.
And now, you see, philosophers like to inflate things. This philosophical inflation, or they want to go for the absolute. And so they think consciousness divides the universe in two. What it's like to be something and everything else. Or they want free will. Either you've got absolute free will. Even God couldn't tell whether Eve would bite the apple. Or free will is an illusion. Those are just bad philosophical ideas. And they're bad for the same reason. They're bad because they have not learned the Darwinian lesson. And that is that anything interesting has gradual edges. There's no sharp line between the things that are alive and the things that aren't. There's no sharp line between the things that are conscious and the things that aren't. There's no sharp line between the things that have free will and the things that aren't. That doesn't mean that there isn't free will. I love David Sanford's argument about mammals. He says, if you take it as essential that every mammal has a mammal for a mother, then there aren't any mammals. Because there'd have to be an infinity of them, which there aren't. What gives? Now, to my amazement, some philosophers go hunting for the prime mammal, in effect. There has to be one mammal, the only mammal that didn't have a mammal for a mother. And they think that unless that's true, there aren't any mammals at all. You and I know better. This is just the Sorites paradox. But the same thing is true of free will. The libertarians think unless there's this moment when an absolutely quantum undetermined choice happens, then you're not responsible for anything that flows thereafter. Nonsense. Free will is an accomplishment, not a metaphysical gift. Some of us have free will, we grew into it. And the same thing is true of consciousness. We grew into consciousness, and we can grow out of it gradually. So, since so many people view this as just repugnant, they really don't like the idea that consciousness comes in degrees, or that free will comes in degrees. Mostly, I think they've abandoned vitalism. They're happy to agree that there's no sharp line between what's living and what isn't. Look at biologists know what life is. They don't bother trying to define it.
Some of them do. I mean, some of them do.
Well, some do, but you know, that's a sort of scholastic enterprise of no real importance. And the same thing is true. Philosophers should stop trying to define consciousness, find the essence of consciousness. Essentialism is a bad idea. We've known that ever since Darwin. And so I think it's important to stress that the very common assumption, even self-congratulatory assumption of people, that they know what consciousness is, and by God, it's not an illusion. I want to rub their noses in the mess that they make with that idea, because I think it's wrong, and they just refuse even to consider that it's wrong. They won't. They say, no, I block my ears. I'm not going to hear that. Well, give it a try. You'd be amazed.
Dan, you mentioned something that I think is important, so I want to make sure it's emphasized. And you referred to something called the Darwinian lesson. And I think it was that most interesting phenomena have gradual edges. And another phrase that comes to mind that I probably picked up from your work is natura non facit saltus. So nature doesn't make jumps. But I was wondering if you could just be explicit about precisely what the Darwinian lesson is.
Yeah. The Darwinian lesson is that, and this goes back to the question that Sean was dealing with back when he was talking about what is it that lets this happen in physics, where we move from low entropy into high entropy, and yet somehow along the way we get things that are stable, that are better at reproducing than the opposition, and that creates life. Where do you draw the line? The first thing that reproduces, is that alive? Who cares? Who cares? Eventually, it's the accumulation of all those little things that have been designed by their own history of reproduction, of replication, things that can detect something. You can use information in their immediate environment to do better at staying alive, at reproducing, at persisting. differential persistence becomes differential reproduction, and that leads to living things. And there's the physicist David Deutsch has a wonderful TED Talk about this, where he talks about the great monotony and how for billions of years, sort of nothing happened, or nothing different, nothing new happened. And then life got started, whether it started on one planet or many. But when life gets started, now suddenly you have all these novelties, all these new compounds. I hadn't realized till I watched that how many of the large molecules on the planet, they didn't exist before life did. Life creates, well, biochemistry, yeah, of course. But biochemistry is a wonderful novelty. It's not out there everywhere in the universe. It's and it changes the pace, it changes what's possible. Stu Kaufman has the term the adjacent possible. Ever since life got started, the adjacent possible has changed and changed and changed and changed. And there are many things that are possible now that were possible even yesterday, or 1,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago. And that's the Darwinian lesson.
Going back to that question I raised of Steve's about parapsychology, clairvoyance. Sean, you said that generally you don't want to spend too much time on these areas because there are no sort of plausible ways that these phenomena could be instantiated, as far as you know. But there is one particular area that you do discuss where, if I'm right, again, to use that terrific neologism of Dan's, you have vanishingly low credence in. And naturally, this is a good place for Dan to weigh in. But so I've never spoken to Philip Goff, but my loose understanding is that the panpsychist believes there are non-physical properties of the mind, which as a physicalist, you totally reject. And yet you spend lots of, well, I don't want to say a lot of time, but I think you've debated him recently. You've talked to Phil, and there are many other sorts of crackpots who think the laws of physics need to be totally changed to accommodate consciousness. And Philip's not, but there are some. So I'm wondering why this is an area that you think is important to talk about, even if you don't have any credence in it.
Well, two things. One is the amount of time I spend talking about panpsychism in particular and consciousness and free will more generally is not at all representative of how much time I spend thinking about these things. Almost all of the time I spend talking about these things is not my fault, or at least not my idea originally. People drag me into it. And I tell them, I say, like, I only have one thing to say, is that if it violates the laws of physics, I'm not interested in it, and apparently it does. Therefore, I'm not interested. And all I can do is say that one thing over and over again. And they keep wanting me to say that one thing. I mean, I literally there was a YouTube comment on my debate with Philip that said, like, Sean Carroll's just saying the same thing he always said. Yes, that's really all I got to say. And I'd be perfectly happy never to say it again. I turned down a whole bunch of invitations that you don't know about to say the same thing over again. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, I put a lot of effort into thinking about what are the ideas I don't agree with that I should at least pay attention to or allow to have time in the discourse, right? Like, how do you divide the line between those ideas you think are wrong and those ideas you think are so wrong you're not even going to listen, right? Blah, 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 blah. Like, you could say exactly the same thing about non-Everettian formulations of quantum mechanics. In my research, I am not spending time thinking about other interpretations of quantum mechanics. I think I know the right one and I move on with that. But I'm not so sure about it. And part of that not being sure is there's a whole bunch of smart people who believe otherwise. So I'm going to give them time on the podcast or whatever, or in talks to state their case. There's a whole bunch of smart people who think that consciousness is not purely physical. I don't get it. I'm completely unpersuaded by everything they have to say, but I'm humble enough to know that I've been wrong before, so I want to keep listening to what they have to say. I doubt that they're going to change my mind, but you never know.
Yeah, I'm very much in agreement with you on that. I have several one-stroke signatures on my email where people send me unsolicited manuscripts they want me to read. And I look at them just enough to see what it's about, and then I apologize for the fact that I don't have time to delve into their particular version. And many of them take that very well. Good for them. I'm happy that. It's funny that some of them get very irate about this. Think, who are you to not look at my 300-page disposition on consciousness? And I think, well, who are you? When Philip Goff puts forward panpsychism, and a point that I like to make about that is, it's not a theory, it's a slogan. Nothing follows from it, as far as I can see. It does not suggest any experiments to run. It doesn't make any predictions. It's just a slogan. And philosophers, most philosophers' theories are just slogans. And a lot of philosophy is just slogan honing, getting the slogan just right. So as counterexample proof, and there's no objections to it. But there it sits, makes no difference. I've suggested my own pan theory, pan-niftyism. Everything's nifty. Every electron, every photon, every string, every brain, everything's nifty. What follows from that? Nothing. And what follows from everything's mental? Nothing. Because whatever Philip means by mental, it doesn't have much to do. You know, if the coffee cup's mental, then it doesn't have much to do with the mind that I'm interested in, which is the kind that people like you two have, largely thanks to the trillion moving part brains that you have. And saying that everything has that property seems to me to be just comically uninformative. So I don't spend my time on it.
When I went to when I did that debate with Philip Goff, who I truly like as a person, and one of the things I like about him the most is his absolute eagerness to engage with people who disagree with him by a lot. But when I did that debate, it was in the context of a workshop on panpsychism, and afterward I said it's like visiting a Reddit message board full of fans of a TV show you've never watched. And they're debating in with true passion about like this or that, and I'm like, well, I don't even know what any of these words mean.
Yeah,
but I do want to, I think that there are things that could be true, but to which I give sufficiently low credences that I'm not going to spend time thinking about them during the day. And panpsychism is one of those. But I absolutely recognize the difficulty in being right about those judgments. I'm sure that some of my cherished beliefs are going to be wrong 100 years from now. Now, if you went down the list of all of my cherished beliefs, I'm not going to give up on any of them. There's this funny rhetorical device where people say, like, so you admit you're going to be wrong. Why don't you admit you're wrong about this? Well, no, I have that cherished belief for good reasons. One of my cherished beliefs might be wrong, but I can't predict ahead of time which ones they're going to be. I don't know. I try my best to navigate this levels of credences issue, but it's tricky. We're all going to judge slightly differently.
And let me just point out that what we're doing right now, because I agree completely with that, is we're not following Descartes. Descartes in the Meditations digs a hole for himself, a hole of skepticism, systematic skepticism, and then he decides that the only way out is if he makes sure his ideas are clear and distinct enough, God will not let him be wrong about them. So he passes the buck to God. And then, of course, he has to prove that God exists. And he doesn't succeed in that, of course. And I think right there is a fundamental tactical error made by a great scientist. What he should have done is said, I want to avoid error. I want to be as sure as possible. I think the best I can do is find the smartest people I can find and deal constructively with them and see if they can change my mind about any of this. And it's a call for modesty of a sort. I'm ready to be taught. Show me. But do show me. If I'm quite prepared to listen if you've got ideas that you think will sway me. But you can't sway me by just pounding your fist and saying, but it's just got to be this way. No, I'd like to see some evidence. I'd like to see some arguments. I'd like to see a surprising result that your theory predicts that mine doesn't. That's what I want to do. And I think this is true even in mathematics. Andrew Wiles proved Fermat's last theorem. Now, if you think you've proved Fermat's last theorem, you really have to consider a disjunction. Either I've proved Fermat's last theorem or I'm going crazy. And many, many very, very smart people thought they'd proved Fermat's last theorem and were wrong. So it's an either or you have to take seriously. Andrew Wiles couldn't know that he'd proved Fermat's last theorem, couldn't comfortably say he knew until the mathematicians who were competing with him for this glory and who were his fellow experts, they went through his proof. They found some problems and he fixed them. And when they conceded, when they agreed that he proved it, then he could believe it's a social fact. And it's a social fact that you can't get around that. You can't ask God to guarantee your clear and distinct ideas. The best you can do is ask your fellow human beings who know lots of things that you don't know and understand lots of things that you don't understand. You got to see what they think. And when you get agreements, there's always a good chance. No, there's a small chance, maybe not vanishing, but small, that you're all wrong. You've led each other down the garden path. We'll find out in 100 years or 200 years. But in the meantime, that's the best we can do.
Since this is the exciting, though a bit chaotic, 200th episode of the show, I thought it would be, given the most recent comments, it would be nice to get a little bit meta. And given, Dan, your comments on panpsychism, as you said, it's kind of just like a slogan. Philosophy is a lot about slogan making. Nothing follows from it. I thought I ought to ask about the two of your views on philosophy, just more generally. And Dan, it seems like you think of philosophy quite broadly as continuous, but and maybe separate from the sciences, but maybe continuous and separate just are actually antonyms. But how do you see the relationship between science and philosophy?
Well, different from the way a lot of philosophers see it. I see philosophy at its best as an arena of thinking where, in one sense, anything goes. But it's only useful if what goes is part of an inquiry that's already going on and that has lots of facts. So I've said, without embarrassment, I think philosophers are better at questions than answers. And I love it when I can meet with scientists and think that I am helping them shape their questions better and cast off some assumptions that they hadn't realized that they were making. That's, I think, a good role for philosophers. My favorite definition of philosophy is Wilfrid Sellars, which is that philosophy is, I want to get it word for word if I can, about how things, in the widest sense of the term, hang together, in the widest sense of the term. Now that seems almost trivial, but let me give you a small sample of the things there are in the widest sense of the term. There's atoms and molecules and the fields and gravity and cells and molecules and voices and democracies and words and pictures and voices and minds and baseball games and home runs and money. What's money made out of? What are baseball games made of? What's democracy made of? These are things in the widest sense of the term. And some of them are just as real, just as important, more important maybe, than the things of physics. The old, it's all atoms in the void, that simplification. Well, if that's your ontology, if that's the kind of only kind of things that you tolerate, you got big problems, because there's lots of things in the world that then you have to declare to be illusory. So for me, philosophy looks pre-theoretically at the candidates for thinghood and decides which ones to take seriously and what follows from the fact that we're taking them seriously.
This description of philosophy as an arena where anything goes, modulo some restrictions, reminds me of a conversation that I had with the philosopher Michael Strevens at NYU about what science is. And he seemed to think of science as an arena where anything goes, but there are some restrictions. And the most important restriction is that one has to reason around evidence that is available for everybody to potentially reproduce or observe. And this immediately brings to mind panpsychism, what we were just talking about, where there is no evidence of this sort, since it's non-physical. But Sean, did you have anything to add to Dan's thoughts on what philosophy
Well, when
is?
you said you were going to start getting meta at the end of the podcast, I thought you were going to encourage Dan to start his own podcast, since, you and I have been very successful here. Like, maybe Dan could become famous if he actually just had a podcast, or maybe Dan and Steve could team up. I don't know. But about philosophy and science, look, I think that they're continuous with each other. I think that most human knowledge is of a continuum, right? I think that physics and philosophy do not have a sharp right line between them. Maybe that's the Darwinian lesson also, but physics and chemistry and biology don't have sharp right lines between them. And biology and psychology and sociology don't have sharp right lines between them. These are categories we invent to make universities. They're not things that are out there in the world. But there are stylistic differences in practice that are absolutely impossible to miss. I mean, Dan is right that philosophers are much better at questions than at answers. If you're a physicist and a philosopher explains to you why you've made a mistake, you should absolutely take them seriously. But if you're a physicist and a philosopher says, here's my theory, you can more or less tune them out. It's very unlikely that that's going to be helpful. And I think that, the stylistic differences, the fact that we have reified these differences in academia is a bigger problem than we let on. I'm very, very privileged right now at Johns Hopkins to have this position where I can do both physics and philosophy and call it natural philosophy. And since I've arrived, I've been getting a lot of emails from undergraduates or high school students saying, how can I do that? That's what I want to do. I want to ask these big questions about the nature of reality, but take science seriously, blah, 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 blah. And I have to be honest. I have to say, look, in the real world, if you want to become a professor and do these things for a living, you have to get a PhD in either physics or philosophy. And those two processes are utterly different. The required courses are different. What you have to learn is different. There is no in between. And you have to make that choice. And that's too bad. Once you make that choice, and while you're in that on that path, you can try to become good enough in your specific field to get a job, and then you can broaden out your actual interests. And that's fine, but we don't give nearly enough encouragement or opportunity to people who want to do these things. And I think that our intellectual life suffers because of that.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think, though, that doing what you'd like to do to encourage that has its risks too. There's a certain sort of curse of interdisciplinarity that leads to facile oversimplification and faddishness. And last thing I would ever want to be is the Dean of Interdisciplinary Studies. But I'm all for interdisciplinary study, but I don't want to institutionalize it like that.
Well, the Santa Fe Institute, though, is a terrific example.
Lovely example.
Where it's done right. I spoke with, I know you probably know him very well, Jeffrey West, about his work. He's a string theorist, a physicist, and he does.
He's absolutely not a string theorist, by the way.
Well, he's done string theory, I think.
Supersymmetry, he did. Supersymmetry and high energy physics, yes. But these little differences matter. The narcissism of small differences is very much
I'm pretty sure, though, that he did say that he was working on string theory. I could be totally wrong. We'll check. I'll email you. I'm curious now.
Maybe it's a new interest of Jeffrey's. He's a.
I think he's probably said supersymmetry.
Okay, but he has done also, of course, this very interesting work in biology, complexity theory, scaling of cities.
Scale is a wonderful book.
Yeah. By the way, at Hopkins in our Natural Philosophy Forum, which Janan Ismail and I have founded, every year we have a distinguished lecturer. And last year our lecturer was Dan Dennett, and this year our lecturer is Jeffrey West.
Oh, I've got great company on the show then. That's great. Well then, one thought about the continuity of science and philosophy. I asked this question to a professor here at Stanford. His name is Nadim Hussain, but he pointed out to me that a lot of the special sciences started with philosophy. So with Aristotle, I mean, Aristotle, I think, was the first biologist in a sense. I recently learned, I've probably mentioned it a number of times, that he was the person who discovered that dolphins aren't fish. But once and Dan, you said that philosophers are better at questions than answers. What seems to be the case is that, or one thing that has been the case historically, is that philosophers have clarified the questions and the concepts, and then once there's an agreed upon methodology for answering or thinking about these questions, they get doled out to the special sciences. But of course, philosophy is still very important when it's done well and involved in those sciences, continuing to clarify the questions.
Yeah, well, there's fossil evidence of that. The American Philosophical Society is a scientific society. It's not philosophers at all, really. It started out that way. So, yeah, philosophy, when it gets questions straight enough to be answered, turns them over to others. But if you look at the history of philosophy, you will see that many of the best philosophers have been scientists themselves. I mean, Descartes, Leibniz, for that matter.
The best philosophers of math.
Yeah, right. Aristotle himself. So, as Sean says, the line between philosophy and science has always been not a drawable line. There's been a joint which has had much traffic going in both directions.
Yeah, I mean, there's a joke that once philosophy starts making progress in some area, you stop calling that area philosophy anymore. You give it a different name and remove it to a different department. But
not for nothing. Is the psychology department at Harvard in William James Hull.
Famous example of a natural philosopher, right?
Who was a professor of philosophy. Yeah, but they rightly named the psychology building after him. Yes.
I have often said that you can't not do philosophy as a scientist. You can only do it badly, or you can only not be aware that you're doing it. But in most science, you can do it badly and you get away with it fine. It's just not necessary, right? If you're doing a certain integral or calculating a certain reaction rate, who cares about the philosophy behind it? I think that the relevant fact is that there are always these subsets of science, whether it's biology or physics or psychology or whatever, where the philosophical issues are front and center. The example I like to use, because it's not the most famous one or the one that people think of, is we built a Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, right? A giant particle accelerator that cost $9 billion and has cost more money since then. And, for good reasons, but one of the biggest single reasons, one of the biggest single motivations for doing that, besides, it's something else to do, was that we had what is called the naturalness problem in physics. We thought that there had to be something called the Higgs boson, and the Higgs boson had to have a certain mass approximately, and that mass is way lower than we expected. So part of the motivation, the justification for spending $9 billion on the Large Hadron Collider was to find the Higgs, but an even bigger part of it was to find all of the other new physics that would help us account for the naturalness problem. And number one, we haven't found anything. beyond the Higgs boson, we were wrong in our expectations. And number two, whether a theory of physics is natural or not is very obviously a philosophy question. And the philosophers haven't faced up to this one, frankly. Like neither the physicists nor the philosophers have really thought deeply about what is meant by these questions, even though we spend literally billions of dollars being motivated by them. So I think there's lots of room for being more serious about the overlap between science and philosophy.
Okay, well, I think that's a terrific place to end this monumental 200th episode of the show. I mean, thank you, Sean. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Steve, for being such, wonderful voices to have had the past couple hundred episodes.
Well, thank you for organizing it.
Yeah, thanks for doing a great podcast, Robinson.